The politicians are put there to give you the idea that you have freedom of choice. You don't. You have no choice. You have owners. They own you.
Unreformed private insurance monopoly in this country.
By the military industrial complex.
Why is that a good thing for America?
Government
It's
is
a big club, and you ain't in it.
There is no democracy.
Nor does the Congress have any control over this cartel.
All day long, beating you over the head in the media, telling you what to believe, what to think.
There is very grave danger.
Because less than 15% of you read newspapers. Because the only truth you know is what you get over the shoe.
It's a business.
They don't want a population of citizens capable of critical thinking. They don't want well-informed, well-educated people capable of critical thinking. They're not interested in that. They want obedient workers.
Welcome, everybody, to Crusade Against Bullshit. I'm your host, Top Reno, and of course, normally I am joined by my co-host, Mr. R.C. Rizza. But we're restarting the Crusade Against Bullshit podcast and, of course, the eventual website and all sorts of other great stuff again. But we're going to start off today with a 10 podcast series called The Great Deception, The Conspiracy for a Counter-Revolution. It'll be 10 30-minute long podcasts, and we're going to try to really not only tell you one of the greatest stories that have been occurring over the past 200 years, 200 plus years, what am I talking about? But we're also going to, try to get you to figure out all these little conspiracies that you hear here and there. That's this. I don't know if I believe that. Maybe I believe that. All of them kind of come together. We're not going to really do too much conspiracy talk, but this is probably the one great conspiracy that all of those that are actually relevant conspiracies, not the tin cap fruitcake ones, those ones will certainly be explained as we cover the history of this country's political division, amongst other things, through this 10 podcast series. Once we're done with the 10 podcast series, RC and I are going to come back on, and we're going to be doing our show as we've always done in great clarity and explain to you the bullshit that's going on in this world, because that's our crusade. And if you want to reach out to us, we'd love for you to follow us on Twitter at The Crusaders BS. That's our Twitter handle. And, of course, you can find Crusade Against Bullshit on Facebook. Just search us out. That's our Facebook page, Crusade Against Bullshit. All right, and we're going to be doing lots of stuff with both those, along with redesigning our website. But we wanted to get started with the podcast. Plus, we've also opened up a YouTube channel that we'll be putting our podcasts on as well. Once our producer, of course, produces those videos, and we will have a producer, believe it or not. We're going to have a 3-man team for this podcast coming up. But for now, it's just really just going to be one. All right, so let's get started. We only got 30 minutes on this podcast. We're already almost down 4 minutes of it. Basically, we're going to start from scratch with this 10-part informative series. Who am I? You want to know what would I know? I mean, everybody always questions the source. Number one, I'm an independent researcher. I'm college educated. I have 2 degrees. My primary one being a bachelor's degree in business from UNLV, the great University of Nevada, Las Vegas. I'm also a veteran, and I'm also an avid historian. Now, you don't have to have a PhD to be an avid historian, but you need to understand true history. You got to understand that George Washington did not cut down a cherry tree, nor did the Pilgrims land at Plymouth Rock, for example. There's a lot of our education system, which is one of the biggest problems we have, which is part of this entire 10-part series, doesn't explain the true history to you. We're going to give it to you, but we're going to focus primarily on the history of how this great deception has occurred through our political system. Now, we're going to start with the Revolutionary War, because that's where it all starts at, really. I mean, let's just start, during the first presidency of our great nation, George Washington. One of the only, factually, maybe the first, I guess you could say maybe the first 5 presidents are really the first 5 true presidents, but you really can't even, you kind of have to leave it really at Washington. It's going to be a tough discussion, but that's a discussion for another day. Let's cover, so you have Washington, all right? And here he is. He forms his cabinet, of course. He makes his Secretary of State Jefferson. He has Alexander Hamilton. All the great folks are involved in his cabinet. And what ends up occurring is the first, and I just want to let you know, from the standpoint of George Washington, he is actually, even though he advocated not having a two-party system, I mean, to the point where, and we'll get to that in a second about his farewell speech, but he also, at the same time, helped form it. Now, so let's get into how this formed and where this all ties into today. We're going to try to cover that much as we possibly can. So, first off, the first thing I guess you could say that occurred in the George Washington politics, because back then there were no liberals, there were no conservatives. There were really pretty much, and I'm going to state this for the record, there were only libertarians. Every single founding father was, in most cases, could be defined, I mean, I want to say every single founding father, because that's just, I don't like having absolutes. So I will say the incredible majority of founding fathers were libertarians, which is what I am, which is what RC is, which is what the show stands for, the libertarian philosophy. They were libertarians. And, there are going to be historians who are going to try to say they're Republicans or Democrats. That's ridiculous. Those parties didn't even exist back then. And these political philosophies have manifested and really converted to some degree, but certainly have evolved throughout time. And you're going to see that evolution. But the primary, obviously, reason why we fought the Revolutionary War was to get away from the monarchy. We didn't want a monarchy here. And in fact, George Washington, and the founding fathers, when they developed the Constitution, made sure that there wasn't a monarchy here and anything even remotely close to it. And that's, of course, checks and balances. They put all that in there. And now we start the big problem. Where did this all go wrong for the liberals, the conservatives, and the libertarians? So in 1791, basically the first party was created by Alexander Hamilton. He created the Federalists. That was your first awesome party. Now, of course, he was within George Washington's cabinet, and along with, I believe, the vice president as well, John Adams, they were the two first primary Federalists. Okay. And then, so then in that same time span, Thomas Jefferson formed his party, the Republican Party. Now, what caused this divide between founding fathers who assumedly knew so much, agreed on so much together to form a nation, but all of a sudden, a few years later, are having these disagreements? Well, the first problem was when, the Jay Treaty. And people have to understand how important the Jay Treaty, made by John Jay, who went to Britain. He was the first Supreme Court justice, I believe. He went all the way to Britain to negotiate a treaty, basically because, tensions were currently high between we just had a revolutionary war with Britain. And there were basically three issues that were key that need to be solved, and as to why this treaty was negotiated. First of all, the British exports were flooding the U.S. markets. They were absolutely flooding the market. Of course, and then of course, Britain blocked trade from America. Sounds familiar, right? Let's talk about Donald Trump and China right now. Yeah, it sounds very, very normal. They had trade restrictions and tariffs on all of our stuff, but they can flood our market with whatever they wanted. They, of course, still occupied northern forts up in northern parts of the country that they were supposed to leave after the Revolutionary War, and when they agreed on I believe it was the Treaty of Paris, 1783. And then, of course, they were impressing American sailors into their navy and military because they were fighting the war with the Napoleonic Wars with France. Okay, so you have all that. So John Jay went there. He negotiated the treaty. He basically got very little out of this treaty. In fact, Britain got everything. The only real concessions that Jay got was that they surrender of the Northwest posts that we wanted. They actually left those. And they did give us the most favored nation status. But outside of that, they didn't stop impressing our soldiers. They restricted our commercial access to the West Indies, and they continued to take our soldiers because they felt they were British citizens, and that's what they can do. And they could still seize our ships as long as they paid us for the value that was taken. Either way, that caused a big divide because it was appeasing Britain. And the Federalists didn't want to appease Britain. They wanted to appease Britain because, and we're going to get to the difference between the Federalists and the Jeffersonians right now because this was a key difference. The Jeffersonians were on the side of France. They were our ally. They were the one who helped us in the Revolutionary War, and now they were fighting war against the very same country that enslaved us. So they were pretty upset, and they wanted to support France. But George Washington wanted to keep the peace with Great Britain, and so in order to do so, he actually ratified this horrible treaty, and this is what split the parties right here. So now you got two parties. Let's cover these two parties. First, you have the Federalists, okay, who believed that they were obviously wealthy. The wealthy should and the educated should lead. That was one of their principles. But they also favored a strong central government. And of course, they were big on manufacturing, shipping, and trade. That was, hallmarks of Alexander Hamilton. And they wanted a loose interpretation of the Constitution. Sound familiar? This is where it started. They believed in a loose interpretation of that Constitution. And then, of course, they were pro-British. They favored a national bank, a.k.a. a central bank. Very bad. And they favored protective tariffs. So if you were to list those things, a lot of people out there listening in the podcast land right now would probably say, I like that, don't like that, like that. Okay, let's go to that's some basics of the Federalists. Let's take a look at some of the Jeffersonian Republicans, as they're known. They believe that the people should have the power. They favored a strong state government. And the exact opposite. They emphasized agriculture. I mean, Jefferson was very much into sustaining yourself, building for yourself, and from there you can grow food and trade it for other stuff. They were strict interpretation of the Constitution. They were pro-French. They did not want a national bank, and they opposed tariffs. Now, so you look at those two, and you say, well, how do those two parties align with what goes on right now? I mean, well, because this doesn't make any sense. You look at this, and you say to yourself, well, I mean, Federalists aren't Republicans, and they aren't Democrats, and Republicans aren't Republicans, modern Republicans and Democrats. And by the way, here's a little funny twist on the world here. As I have my notes in my hand, you probably can hear them. Modern historians call Thomas Jefferson's party the Democratic Republicans. And they do that for two reasons. Number one, because everybody wants to put their claim on one of the great founding fathers as being a liberal or being a conservative. Well, heck, the Libertarian Party gets him because he's a libertarian. But if you actually, plus then, of course, a lot of the Jeffersonian Republicans split off into the Democratic Party, which we'll cover in the next show. But that being said, they were Republicans. And that's what they were called. Now, were they modern-day Republicans? Heck no, they weren't. But they were called Republicans. So trying to play this little twist on words in the education system so people think, oh, my God, Thomas Jefferson was a Republican or he was a Democrat. Yeah, it doesn't work that way. They were Republican, but they were libertarian in their point of view. And you could see the libertarianism in the way that they viewed their political standings. All right, so let's get back to the Federalists and the Republicans. So you finally have your two first parties, okay? And they get split on the John Jay Treaty. They also get split on the National Bank, which gets put into place. The first bank of the United States happens anyways at Alexander Hamilton's wishes. And this, let me tell you, this thoroughly upset George Washington. And in fact, in his farewell speech, and I'm going to read you a segment of his farewell speech, and I hope I can do this justice because this is not my language. But basically what Washington came down and said was, the disorders and miseries which result gradually incline the minds of men to seek security and repose in absolute power of the individual, and sooner or later the chief of some prevailing faction, more able or more fortunate than its competitors, turns this disposition to the purposes of his own elevation and to the ruins of public liberty. Without looking forward to the extremity of this kind, which nevertheless not to be entirely out of sight, the common and continual mischiefs of the spirit of a party are sufficient to make it the interest and duty of a wise people to discourage and restrain it. And basically what he's saying there is listen, people are going to take advantage of this power of this party. They're going to use the party not for the will of the people, not for the good of the people, but for what their own personal gains. He went on to say, it serves always to distract the public councils and enfeeble the public administration. It agitates the community with ill-founded jealousies and false alarms, kindles the animosity of one part against another, foments occasionally riot and insurrection. It opens the door to foreign influence and corruption, which finds a facilitated access to the government itself through which the channels of the party passion, which channels it through the party's passion. Thus, the policy and the will of one country are subject to the policy and the will of another. He was not happy. Let's just say that. And what he said right there is exactly what's going on today. I mean, how can this man see 200 years into the future? Almost 250 years into the future we're going on here. I mean, how does he do that? Actually, technically, I think this is actually 240. We're right in the spot. All right, great. 2016, 240th anniversary. All right, so anyhow, that's what he saw. So he saw it, and it's happening now. But when you go back, you got to remember, at the point, this is where the conspiracy starts. At the point of the revolution, everybody knew a king. That's what you knew. You knew and you understood that there was a king and a queen, and they ruled you. So just because we fought a revolution doesn't mean that every American didn't still believe in a monarchy. It doesn't mean every American was pro-American. I mean, heck, if you got stuck in the revolution and you still want to be British and you just kept your mouth shut so you didn't get hurt, you were still there. And there were people within the cabinet who still believed in that the elites should run the country, that they still believed that the rich should run the country and that we should have a king. In fact, folks like Alexander Hamilton wanted to actually call George Washington Your Highness. He said, heck no, and they actually want to put that in the Constitution, if I'm not mistaken. You could correct me on that fact. But I believe they actually even want to put that in the Constitution, refer to him as Your Highness. So there were people who still believed in that, and whether it was subconscious to them that they were doing this, or it was conscious to them what they were doing, the Federalists wanted to maintain the monarchy. That's why they believed in a strong central government, full tilt. That's why they believed, that they should have a national bank, because if you control the money-making capabilities of a country, I care not who makes the laws, as the Rothschilds have said. That's why that they wanted a protective terror to protect their kingdom, and that's also why they were pro-British, because that's what they supported, was another monarchy. They weren't pro-France, who was going free. They wanted to protect another monarchy, and of course, they were the wealthy and they were the well-educated, and obviously that is what the elite want. So the elite popped out and said, no, we're starting another revolution. This is the counter-revolution to the American Revolution. We're going to take back America, but we're not going to take it back for the British. We're going to form our own monarchy right here. We're going to, we can't do it. Americans will never accept king and queen, so we're going to keep it as a president and a government, but we're going to do it our way, and we're going to loosely interpret the Constitution, because if we interpret the Constitution as it says, we're not going to be able to get the things we want. So they made sure they had a loose interpretation of the Constitution in order to get the things that they wanted. Bah humbug, Alexander Hamilton, and you're on the $10 bill? Please. And they just now changed, they took off Andrew Jackson off of the $20 bill for Harriet Tubman. Fine, great choice on Harriet Tubman, that's fine. But, you really should have taken the Alexander Hamilton approach and not the Andrew Jackson. But, when we get to Andrew Jackson next show, he has his own hellfire amount of problems. I'll make up whatever word I can throw in there. He did some great things and he did some horrendous things, but he's a major player in this whole game here that we're playing here. So, and bear in mind, when I talk about this conspiracy, you have to understand in the context of Alexander Hamilton and John Adams and all of these, older politicians that are over 200 years old. Let me tell you something. Not everyone was a willing participant in the conspiracy. And some not only had no idea, but others probably knew but didn't understand the vastness of what they were doing. Because the people who understand the vastness of what's going on here with this conspiracy would be like the bankers and the super elite and the King of England and folks like that who had that access to knowing what was truly going on. Did Alexander Hamilton truly know what was going on? I think he was. I think he had a very good idea of it. And in fact, we'll get into the whole Freemason thing that actually jumped up during the Jackson campaign. We'll have some fun with that. But either way, we're running low on time, so I want to make sure I get everything in. So getting back to, so just I understand that not every person is a willing participant. For example, I don't think John Adams was a willing participant in letting the monarchy regain control in a counter-revolution. I believe that he was a pawn and used by them, in a way that he did not fully understand. And like many politicians that followed him on both sides of the aisles, by the way. Because this is not going to be something where it's all liberals. It's both sides of the aisles jump in on this fray, but you're going to see it unfold in front of you. So now you have it unfolding. The start of it starts with the Federalists. The Federalists come in. They not only come out of the world's greatest president's cabinet, but they are relentless in what they want, and they signed. Just signing the the Jay Treaty was horrible. It was just a horrible example of how bad these guys were. Let me take a little drink of water here. And it was so unpopular, by the way, that even George Washington got cut to pieces in the press of the day and by the people for signing that crappy treaty. All right, so now we're on. So now you have them battling it out, and of course, the second president of the United States is John Adams. So the Federalists get their president as a second president, and of course, he continues the Federalist approach. He does not. They get in a war of words with the Jeffersonian Republicans. And by the way, Jefferson had some muscle behind him too. He had guys like Monroe and Madison standing behind him, who were great Republicans, who sat there and stood behind him, and they frankly became the third, fourth, and fifth presidents of the nation. And that's where the trouble started for the Federalists. See, the Federalists weren't popular because most Americans didn't like particularly in the South. They hated the tariffs, and secondly, because it just made things more expensive for them. But secondly, I'm blanking on my second one here. Oh, most Americans weren't super rich. Okay, at this point, they were mostly farmers. So they sided with the Republicans. So in the next election, and this is frankly, in the election of 1800, it has to be a pretty good understanding that you have to understand that if it wasn't for the 3/5 vote, the 3/5 clause of the Constitution, that really, frankly, or the fact that that Southerners were allowed to count slaves, John Adams would have been reelected again. There's a great book called The Negro President, and I'm blanking on the author. It's terrible on me, but you can look it up, just The Negro President, where he writes about how Thomas Jefferson won that election with the black vote. Now, there's a lot of people, by the way, and I did want to discuss this, and I'll discuss it try to discuss it under a minute. The Constitution is sometimes called a racist document because of the 3/5 clause, which says that each black person counts as only 3/5 of a vote in the South, and basically because that's where they really were. But in fact, and if you want to look at it in that pessimistic way, you can. Freedom, it's all yours, but you're wrong. It was actually an anti-slavery document, because what they were doing is they were limiting the power of the South. They were trying to say, listen, we want to get together and have a country and have a constitution, but there's no way we're going to let you, for every slave you have a full vote for that slave, and then you're going to take over and make all these laws and get all these people voted in, and we're going to have more slave states. We're going to give you 3/5. So by doing that, they limited the impact and the power that the South had in the voting obviously for congressmen, senators, once we actually voted for senators, and of course presidents. So that is the way it went, and I think that if we look at it, we kind of think it looks like it's a pretty fair, pretty anti-slavery thing to do for our great founding fathers. Okay, who of course some of them were actually slave owners. All right, so moving on. Now we're at this point, the juncture. We have this great election. Thomas Jefferson wins it, and that is where it comes close to be pretty much the end for the Federalists. They still held some strong powers, but that really didn't really end it for them. But I believe that'd be their last president that they would have in the White House. And let me tell you something about Thomas Jefferson. He once said, and this is when he was writing, I think this is a letter to John Wise. He wrote in there, he goes, that he wrote with wonder and mortification that much of the political table-talking government circles revolved around the preference of kingly over republican government. Now, this is when he was in the cabinet meetings with Washington. So he had seen it. He had seen that. It's like, wait a second, there is an actual conspiracy to really have another king. Hey, who doesn't want to be king? Yeah, it's good to be the king. Who doesn't want to be king? And that's what he heard, and that, and that's where the Federalists came from. So he made his life mission to fight the Federalists, and that's why, to his dying day, him and John Adams went tooth and nail against each other for political control of this country till their dying day, 50 years after the Declaration of Independence was signed. Okay. So now we get to what this all means. Now you have the Jefferson Republicans. They take over. They're committed to state rights. They're committed to the people, particularly farmers. They believe in the principles of republicanism, which I'm not talking about the Republican Party. I'm talking about government, which a government, the republic. We are a republic. We are not a democracy. It is not mob rule in our country. We did a republic where it is where the people would elect the senators and the congressmen, and originally it wasn't even we elected those people, state legislators did, but that's what it was supposed to be. We elect the representatives and they pass the laws for us, not, hey, if 51 out of 100 people vote to kill that guy dies. That's democracy. That is not what we are. We are a republic, and those are the virtues that he laid down, principles, what's the difference? Principles of republicanism. They also, of course, wanted, like I said before, good relations with Europe, especially France, who was one of our strong allies. So basically, a couple of bad things happened around 1811. So you have Thomas Jefferson. He has his presidency. So now you go into the Monroe dynasty, or the Madison dynasty. Excuse me, I get Madison and Monroe mixed up. Both 6 letters, both start with an M. So you get into the Madison dynasty. Now, and you start having some issues. Number one, the Jay Treaty expires, okay? And that basically brings on war, because now you have Republicans in the office. Now the British don't have the treaty. What do? They start impressing sailors again. So for the first time in the history of our country, and doing much other things, of course, it was a lot less simpler than that. But we start a war with them. And what else expired was the first U.S. bank, also expired the following year. So you have the Jay Treaty expire the following year in 1811. The first bank of the United States expires, and it goes through with a hush, because the Republicans wanted nothing to do with the national bank. We want to print our own money. We got rid of the national bank for the first time. Had a balanced budget, I believe. Well, no, we did owe money. That's wrong. We didn't balance the budget until Jackson. But anyways, but then we actually, for the first time as a country, declare war on Great Britain for many reasons, including the oppressment of our sellers. Okay. The War of 1812 destroyed the Federalists as we knew them. After the War of 1812, they were all but gone. And in fact, how do you want to put this? There was a lot of problems that we were having with Britain. Britain was using Indians to attack us, from Canada. They wouldn't give us Canada. Number two, we also did want Canada. Believe it or not, we did. But they were, of course, were also stopping us from having trade deals with France, because not only because of the Jay Treaty, but because of just the fact that they were at war with them. So there was a lot of good reasons why we actually went to war with England. But after the war obviously ended in 1812. It was, they burned Washington. Andrew Jackson had the mighty Battle of New Orleans and won even after the peace treaty was signed. And at the end of the war, nothing changed hands. Absolutely nothing changed in history. And after that, there was no more Federalist Party, and we entered the age, the only age, era of good feeling. And this was with Madison and Monroe. We entered the age of good feeling. And we're going to kind of end it there, because the age of good feeling goes until, I guess, about maybe 1820, where it kind of stops, where everything's quiet. We only have one party. There's only one party left in the country, and that one party is the Republican Party. And that upset some people, obviously, but for about a good, I would say, 6 to 8 years, there's relative peace. There's no arguing. Country gets along well. Country moves forward well. Things work out great. But then you get then you enter in, and this is the teaser for the next show, then enters in Andrew Jackson, the war hero, Senator Andrew Jackson enters the fray, and we also, of course, get John Quincy Adams. I believe he, even I try to remember what party he was part of. Maybe he was the last remnant of the Federalist Party, because his father. But now we enter into that realm, and that's what we're going to get into in the next show. We're going to get into the era of Jacksonian democracy. But as you can see right now, the original Republicans, we're going to end it on this. The original Republicans were, in fact, libertarians. They weren't liberals. They weren't conservatives. The original Republicans were the people who kept this country the way they wanted it, the republic. They kept this country by strict constitutional interpretation. They did not want a bank running our money and running our lives, and they wanted the states to have right, not an almighty monarchy-based government, which I can say that right. That's not what they wanted. They actually wanted to keep the country what we had planned it with the Declaration of Independence and what we had planned it with the Constitution, Bill of Rights, and so forth and so on. That's what they wanted. And that's why they were the libertarians. So as we start, we have the monarchy federalists who were basically defeated and rooted out by the libertarian Republicans. Next show enters the Democratic Party. I'll see you guys all later. This was episode 1 of The Great Deception, The Conspiracy for a Counter-Revolution. Check us out again. Follow us on Twitter at the Crusaders BS on Twitter. And, of course, look for Crusade Against Bullshit on Facebook. I'm your host, Todd Perino. Thank you guys for listening, and we'll be back in a couple of days, maybe hopefully less than a week, with episode 2. Also look for us on YouTube in the coming week. We're going to start adding all these episodes on YouTube with all kinds of other little bonus photos and funny words. There you go. All right. Thank you, guys.